Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name's Hugh Stewart, and tonight we're going to be discussing a number of topics, in particular the economy, with our guest William Duguid. Duguid, so thank you for joining us, William. Can you hear us loud and clear?
I can hear you loud and clear if you can hear me.
That's fine. That's excellent. So, William, obviously the big topics today concern the economy, so we'll be looking at those in a few minutes. But first of all, I'm going to go through the latest from Russia's attack on Ukraine. Today, we come to day 236. Here are the main points. At least 4 people have been killed and 3 others hospitalized after a series of kamikaze drone attacks on Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, according to the mayor Vitaly Klitschko. Mayor Klitschko added that 18 people have been rescued and there have been 5 explosions after 28 drones were directed at the city. Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolak said that after a new wave of drone attacks, Russia should be expelled from the G20 group of nations. The European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell said that the bloc should look for concrete evidence about the participation of Iran in Russia's war on Ukraine. The European Union has agreed to create a mission to train 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers and will also provide a further €500 million to help buy weapons for Ukraine. EU officials hope the mission, which is expected to cost €107 million, will be up and running by mid-November. Ole Senubov, the governor of Kharkiv, has said that 1 person has died and 2 have been wounded by Russian strikes in the region in the last 24 hours. The regional governor of the eastern region of Sumy, Dmitry Zvitsky, has said that 3 people were killed and 9 more were injured in a rocket attack this morning. Russian news agency TASS is reporting that buses are once again being allowed to cross the Crimea Bridge, which was damaged in that attack a few days ago. The UK Ministry of Defence says in its latest update that Russia is likely facing more acute logistical challenges as a result of the Kerch Bridge bombing on October 8th. The operator of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, ZNPP, said again it has been disconnected from external power supplies as the result of Russian shelling. Marina Ossianikova, the former Russian state TV journalist who staged an on-air protest against the war in March, has fled the country, according to her lawyer. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its economic fallout have thrown 4 million children into poverty across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the UN Children's Agency UNICEF has said. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Sunday that a very severe situation persists in the eastern Donetsk and Luhansk regions, with the most difficult fighting near the town of Bakhmut. The attacks came as Russia's war in Ukraine nears its 8-month mark. Ukraine has succeeded in maintaining its energy stability after Russian attacks last week, which targeted key parts of its infrastructure, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal has said. And finally, the Belarusian Defense Ministry has said that just under 9,000 Russian troops will be stationed in Belarus as part of the regional grouping of forces to protect its borders. So that's the latest on Ukraine's defence from Russian attack. Now, let's move on, William, to the main topic tonight. Today, we've been looking at I'm sure you have as well as I have, reading through the Scottish Government's briefing paper on the economies of independence. I've been going through that myself today. I certainly can't claim to have read all of it, 108 pages. Have you had the time to look at some of it yourself?
Yeah, of course, you read it online, so you don't actually guess how long it is until you've started. So I started by taking notes, and once I'd taken 20 pages of notes, I'd made it sort of 2/3 of the way through. So I kind of speed read the rest. Do your guests normally confess how unprepared they are? Oh dear, I shouldn't probably, but it was an interesting one, though.
Well, when you say unprepared, I was full of admiration for the journalists who spoke to the First Minister this morning. They seem to have read the whole thing before they had their key questions ready. Maybe they're quicker than you and I. Well, let's look at the detail first of all. Let's summarise what's in those 108 pages. Independence is essential to build a fairer, stronger and greener Scotland, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said as she launched the Scottish Government's independence economy proposals. The First Minister said in the paper Building a New Scotland, a Stronger Economy with Independence, which sets out plans to make the economy work for everyone and to forge a different path to the Brexit-based UK economy, which, as outlined in the first paper a couple of months ago, is poorer and more unequal than equivalent European countries. Today's paper concludes rejoining the European Union means that Scotland can benefit from and contribute to the vast European single market while helping to forge a different path to the UK system. There will be a redesigned energy market that aims to provide secure and low-cost, reliable energy. We can retain the free movement of people without a passport across the UK and Ireland, with trade borders smoothly implemented. Scotland will continue to use the pound sterling until the time is right to move towards the Scottish pound. Up to £20 billion in major infrastructure investment will come through the Building the New Scotland Fund, including investment in more energy efficient homes, in greener transport, better digital and mobile connectivity, and more affordable housing. Scotland will be able to use the full powers over employment law to help improve pay and working conditions for people across Scotland, including introducing a minimum wage with a single rate for all age groups and stronger access to flexible working. And two further points, the plan for better industrial relations through a social partnership approach involving business and unions. And finally, on these main summary points, a migration policy tailored to suit Scotland's needs and designed to boost the working population. The white paper outlines the new institutions which would be set up to manage the Scottish economy, including the Scottish Central Bank and a new debt management office. Credible and responsible fiscal rules on borrowing and other key measures will be independently assessed by an enhanced Scottish Fiscal Commission. Speaking as the paper was published, which was earlier today, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said, "For Scotland, not being independent means we're dragged down the wrong path one our people in Scotland did not vote for." That's a fundamental point we make in this paper. Independence is not an abstract argument separate from people's daily lives. It's at the heart. It has as its heart the ambition, and crucially, it equips us with the essential tools to build a fairer, greener, wealthier, and happier country. So, William, I've just outlined, I think, about 9 or 10 bullet points, which summarises. I guess what people in the media are going to mainly focus on are issues such as the transition to a Scottish currency, or the border issues as Scotland will be in Europe while England is outside. Do you think those are the main issues that the media is going to talk about?
Certainly, the main issues that came up in the First Minister's press conference, the currency did a couple of times, and then the border increasingly came in, particularly when the guy from ITV Border asked his question. So, I think those will be the things they dwell in. The sort of wider independence movement will also, I think, focus on the currency side because it is a question we're often asked. And because certainly some of the initial statements from independent supporters are expressing a wee bit of concern about an overlong period of sterlingization, as you would call it, before we actually move to a new Scottish currency. I think we've moved on considerably from the Sustainable Growth Commission remarks a few years ago, when it looked as if we might be stuck with sterling for quite some time, maybe even 10 years, and when there were perhaps rules that were a bit of a straitjacket before we could transfer to our own currency. But nevertheless, there is an element of risk, I think, in sticking with sterling, and some people are a wee bit uneasy about that.
Yes, of course. It looks like the timetable is accelerated, but one of the points the First Minister made in a press conference today is that she refused to be drawn on a timetable. So I think she's putting what you might call a criteria rule on moving to the new currency. So basically, the criteria are once the Scottish financial institutions have been up and running, or once they're accepted by the finance community, then it could be time to move to the new Scottish pound. You think she's right to say we'll do it when it's ready? We'll do it when the Scottish Central Bank advises us, and I'm not going to put an actual deadline on it.
I think that's fairly sensible in principle. There is an element of just marks for artistic merit to an extent, where everything has to be absolutely hunky dory and in place. And you always have to bear in mind that you might be forced to do things faster. For example, if sterling absolutely tanks at some point, we're setting a lot of store in the UK government perhaps retaining or regaining rather some of its sanity. I'm not entirely sure that that's going to happen in the short term, and certainly not the term in which we're campaigning. So, yeah, I think it's right not to set a timetable, because that in itself lays traps that you might yourself fall into. But I think there needs to be just a wee plan B in the background where we can accelerate it if we absolutely have to.
Well, I suppose one of the issues, one of the unknowns, is how well the Bank of England is going to cooperate. The First Minister did say that things that happen in the future are uncertain, didn't she? She said maybe independence is uncertain, but certainly remaining in the UK is uncertain at the moment. So she did make that general philosophical point that none of us in our lives or as nations actually know what's happening next year. So do you think that's going to be a strong point when people say, when opponents, of course, will definitely say, you're not giving us any detail, you haven't given us a precise timetable? How do you think it'll go down with the voters, particularly if people who haven't made their mind up? If the First Minister says, of course, the future is uncertain, so we can't actually give exact dates. But her big argument is that if you're faced with uncertainty, it's best to be in charge of your own decisions. Is that in your opinion, an
I think
argument that's
that's a
going to
very
play with
attractive
voters?
argument. A very attractive argument for anybody who's witnessed what's happened with the UK government over the last few weeks and months. Um, Uncertainty is absolutely inherent in everything that's going on at the minute, um, both here and further afield. And there's no doubt whatsoever that the way the balance of risk can be represented in the campaign is entirely different from 2014. We've now seen what can happen when you're tied to the UK and things happen that you don't want to happen. So I think it's absolutely right that she's taken that sort of approach and saying, look, everything is uncertain, and let's be in control. Let's have some thing we can do where we're not just forced along as if shackled to something. So I think that will go down quite well with the voters. I'm not go well with the economy. That's to be seen over the next little while.
Okay, so I thought it would be obviously the important point that people will be talking about tonight was currency, but there's lots of other issues as we just outlined in those quick bullet points. Now let's look at some of the other issues before we move on to the single market and joining the EU. I'll deal with that in a couple of minutes. But there's also some ideas here which I think must be put in to sell the idea of independence. Would you agree? Such as we're going to have full control over employment law, and therefore we're going to make it better. We're going to improve workers' rights. And also, we're going to have control over the North Sea oil revenues. So we're going to use that to insulate your houses and to green transport. So these are obviously popular measures, but again, will they work with the floating voter? Will people say, yes, it's just words, but can you actually deliver it?
Our opponents will say just words, but actually, it's what a lot of voters have been wanting to hear. Particularly in the early part of the report, the word well-being appears quite a lot. And well-being can be a general term to cover some of the things you've talked about, and indeed some other things. And certainly the polling that Believe in Scotland has carried out at the weekend, it was unequivocally the case that if you were to put before voters an offering which had an improved pension and a well-being economy, as these voters understand it, you were looking at an independence vote of 61% instead of a 50-50 split. And what that says to me is that any suggestion that Scotland might be a wee bit like the UK, only in sort of mini form, is absolutely a turn-off with the voters. And those other things are an absolute incentive for voters to want independence. They want independence for change. It doesn't need to be radical, rip everything up change. It just needs to be change that changes the balance of the way we see the economy and what it's for. And I do think the paper did come up with that.
Yes, people read the paper, and I hope you do have a chance to read it. At least a summary, although it is very long, as you know, William. But the summary might be something a bit more digestible. But there's a lot of ideas in there about what kind of country we want to be, and that includes, as I said, raising the minimum wage for all age groups. So the SNP wants to eliminate the idea that you can get young workers cheap, and it also wants to establish the idea that unions are in partnership with businesses. Is that more of a European model? It's quite normal, I think, for large institutions to actually invite the trade unions onto the senior boards making decisions. Is that more? Is that the sort of thing they have in mind there?
I think it even, yeah, I think it even mentions in the report that generally speaking, and particularly in European economies, but in the top economies, there tends to be a lot more collaboration going on. We're still very polarized in the way we do things sometimes in the UK. And there is certainly a gravitational pull in the report away from that kind of thinking and towards involving all stakeholders, all parties genuinely in decision making and how you rub along together.
And I expect the First Minister also cites that as another contrast with the UK model, which is more confrontational, and as the White Paper says, is more unequal. The inequality is increasing. So again, the White Paper makes it clear that the future of Scotland should be less equal, less unequal. And so again, this comes up several times, and the First Minister said it too. She said that Scotland is moving in one direction, the rest of the UK is moving in another. So again, she thinks that's a message which people in Scotland want to hear. Do you think that will
I think it is. Yeah, inequality is a drag anchor on any economy. It really is, and it's particularly true of the UK economy. And I do think there has always been the philosophical idea in Scotland that we are all jock tamps and spearns, and that inequality is not a great thing that we should be supporting. I think it will resonate with voters if it can be made to stick in the campaign. Um, we're putting this out a year before perhaps a referendum. There's still a lot of fighting to do, and there are a lot of blanks still to fill in. The detail of some of the aspects, such as the EU and the Green Revolution, all that still perhaps to come. But there's a lot, I think, for voters to be very happy about there.
Well, you've raised the EU, so before we move on, let's look at that. So the paper makes it absolutely clear an independent Scotland will apply to join the EU. And as we said earlier on, have the benefit of joining the biggest market in the world. So there's information given in the paper about how much we export to the European Union and how that can be expected to grow once Scotland's in it. Now, of course, this is again one that's really pushing on an open door. Most of Scottish voters want to be in the EU, don't they? So, from what I've read, there's the 62% to join the EU, to stay in the EU. That number will probably be bigger now. Have you read any soundings along those lines? So again, is that a winner?
Yeah,
in the Scotland.
It's a winner. Yeah. Again, the polling that I'm aware of, and this is largely polling that Believe in Scotland has carried out, indicates that an unequivocal assertion that we will be looking to rejoin the EU at the earliest opportunity is a winner, and that looking at the other potential routes, such as EFTA and others, is actually a turn-off, because it's a case of when you're explaining you're losing. Most people would raise an eyebrow if you had an in Scotland that didn't want to get back in the EU, because we've been quite rightly complaining about it being dragged out against our will ever since 2016. Yeah, I think that is a winner. The interesting question, of course, with the EU, that fits in with the currency timetable. I know there isn't a timetable, but in real life, it's going to take a wee while. We are at a situation where we vote for independence, and then the transition period merely gets us to the point where we've put the arrangements in place to work with sterling. And then it's a question mark how much longer it takes before we can get to a new currency of our own. And whereas we can apply to join the EU when we have when we're basically using sterling, we can't actually get in there until we have our own currency. I think that's the way it works. And that will be a little bit of a concern for some people. although it will depend on transitional arrangements with the EU we can have in place as far as trade and the fourth. And if we can basically get access to the single market on reasonable terms, then I think that won't be so much of an issue.
Yes, again, the First Minister has made it clear, and it's very well explained in the paper if people take the time to read it, how the transition will happen. For instance, there's not going to be any situation where Scotland finds itself one day out of the European Union and out of the UK and sort of wandering around on their own. That's not going to happen. The transition is clearly explained, and we won't move on to the next stage until the last stage has been completed. I think the First Minister also said, or else it's maybe in the paper, I forget if I read it or if I heard it, but we don't actually leave the UK until all the negotiations have been complete. We might be two or 3 years talking to the UK and at the same time talking to the EU. So there's never going to be a situation where we suddenly find ourselves alone and friendless. So, I mean, that's a thing that I've heard unionists say, you're going to be isolated. But I think it looks like the paper makes that clear. Do you agree there will be a sensible transition? We won't actually leave the UK until we're ready.
Yeah, I think, though, we should be trying to be out of the UK before the next Scottish election, I suggest, in 2026. That would be a good idea, because that otherwise lays open the possibility of some sort of spoiling operation being done on the unionist side. So I don't think we can hang around for as long as all that.
Okay, yeah, again, no timescales have been given, but yeah, surely we can do it in that time. Right, let's move on, William, to the next statement. So we are still, of course, under the UK system, and we still, of course, have to go along with whichever policies the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer advises. So today, as people probably have heard, the new Chancellor, I think he's been a Chancellor since last Friday, Jeremy Hunt, made a statement in which he basically reversed the mini budget of his predecessor, which was made a couple of weeks ago. Jeremy Hunt has indeed today ripped up almost all of Liz Truss's disastrous mini budget. That's Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's budget, scrapping virtually all of the announced tax cuts and drastically scaling back the government's flagship plan to cap rising energy prices. And what amounts to an utter humiliation for a Prime Minister who now seems stripped of any political authority, the new Chancellor said the only remaining tax cuts would be those already in place, removed to reverse the recent rise in national insurance, and a cut to stamp duty, which refers to England and Wales only, not to Scotland anyway. In a televised briefing before the Commons Statements, which was today, Monday afternoon, Mr Hunt, who was appointed on Friday in place of the sacked Kwasi Kwarteng, said the plan to cut the basic rate of income tax by 1p to 19p in April, a significant part of the mini-budget, would be frozen indefinitely. The Prime Minister did not turn up to the House of Commons urgent question today on the economic situation, but instead sent Penny Mordaunt, who is the leader of the Commons, in place. Truss had been detained to business, Mordaunt told the Commons to laughter from opposition MPs. On the PM's absence, Labour leader Keir Starmer joked, the lady's not for turning up. Including the budgetary U-turn in his statement, Hunt argued that he wanted to cut taxes, adding, but at a time when markets are rightly demanding commitment to sustainable public finances. It's not right to borrow to fund this tax cut. The other tax cuts announced by Kwarteng to dividend taxes, to off-payroll working charges, to VAT-free shopping schemes, and to a freeze on some alcohol duties would also be scrapped, he said. Mr Hunt said the tax changes are intended to bring confidence and stability and would save about £32 billion a year. Even more significantly, in an attempt to claw back spending and to boost revenue, the Chancellor also announced that the government's scheme to cap energy prices for 2 years, costing about £80 billion, would only apply to April for everyone, and after that it'll be more targeted. The SNP says it's now a question of when and not if Liz Truss will be removed from office following this Chancellor's statement, junking the disastrous mini-budget, and confirmed plans to usher in a new era of devastating Tory austerity. The SNP Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis MP said Liz Truss has run out of road. It's no longer a question of if, but when the Prime Minister will be removed from office after the Chancellor junked a disastrous mini-budget. The Chancellor's statement was more than just another round of screeching U-turns. It also confirmed plans to usher in a new era of devastating Tory austerity, which will further entrench the poverty the Tories have caused. Rather than delivering real and targeted support as households and businesses grapple with the cost of living crisis, the Chancellor has instead scaled back the limited support that was in place and backed plans for deep public spending cuts. So, William, good news and bad news. So, surely everyone, just about everyone in the political spectrum, supports the U-turn. There's no longer going to be those cut to rich persons' taxes. But should we be worried about austerity, in particular about the chance that quite a lot of people's bills will be rising even more massively next April?
I'm very worried about austerity. Jeremy Hunt, amazing we're in a world where Jeremy Hunt is suddenly seen as a safe pair of hands, but I think we are in that territory just for the moment. It may not always look that way once he's a wee bit of a run, but I'm very concerned. I mean, for me, even real terms spending cuts, when it comes to the actual financial review, are going to be damaging, because it just seems to me you cannot expect the economy to grow if government isn't spending, or it isn't spending as much as it could, and consumers aren't spending, they can't, because it's all gone on increased mortgage payments, or indeed increased energy costs, because the cap is not that generous a cap. So there is still a cliff edge. All we have done is, I hope, calm down the market so we're not in an absolute crazy whirlwind ride over the edge of cliff. The cliff edge is still there, and I think that spells trouble ahead. Now is the time for the government, funded however it wants to do it, windfall taxes or whatever, actually to spend money in the economy to keep things, to try and produce some form of growth that will get us out of this. And the fact that energy help is ending after 6 months, and then we get what they will regard as targeted, but people always fall through the cracks. And I still don't know what happens with businesses under that scheme. That in itself is another problem. The economy is beginning to fracture right now. I mean, one of the barometers for me is the restaurant scene in Perth. Things are closing. Hospitality is really in trouble, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. Retail will be the same. He's got his work cut out, has Mr. Hunt, and sort of work to do when it comes to the actual review in a couple of weeks.
Of course, the big thing that Liz Truss said last week, and ever since she got the job, is growth. I'm going to go for growth. And she, remember, a couple of weeks ago denounced anyone who disagrees with that as being anti-growth. But incidentally, this refers back to the document, the Scottish document, which does actually have a very interesting economic analysis of trickle-down growth. And if people want to read about that, have a look at it in the Scottish document. And it quotes a lot of economists saying it doesn't work. The idea of trickle-down growth, of course, which was Truss's big idea, is I'm going to make everybody richer by making rich people even more richer, in the hope that they'll give the riches to somebody else. No, they won't. Again, that's argued by, I think they do say some economists, maybe some very conservative economists, go for trickle down, but the vast majority of economists don't. So would you agree with the general idea? As far as I know, most economists say if you want to go for growth, you have to have two things. You have to have demand, you have to have money in people's pockets so they can go and spend. And secondly, you have to have investment. Businesses have to be confident that they're going to have customers, and therefore they will put money into the business. So, I mean, that's not me saying that. That's normal economics, isn't it? If people haven't got money to spend, how's the economy going to grow?
You have to do things. You have to have money in people's pockets. You have to encourage investment, and it's a really rubbish idea to cut yourself off from your main trading area, as we did with Brexit. The effects of that on the British economy moving forward for years to come are going to be another drag anchor, this time a drag anchor on growth and a drag anchor on prosperity. So I'm probably part of the anti-growth coalition because I believe a lot can be achieved in the short term just by redistribution growth. And there are other things than growth to take care of. And certainly the Scottish Government paper goes into that in a wee bit of detail. So I still am exceptionally worried about where we're going with the UK economy and the knock-on effect on Scotland, because when Scotland does become independent, I don't really want to be building from a situation of absolute wreckage, and we get closer to that with every day.
So as far as you're concerned, sooner rather than later. But let's just, before we move on from this topic, then, the obvious thing to discuss really on today's lack of appearance by the Prime Minister is, do you think she herself has decided the game's up? Do you think she's trying to find an excuse? Maybe she'll develop a political illness or something like that. Do you feel any sympathy for Liz Truss? She's clearly taken on a job for which she's unqualified.
She always has appeared to me out of her depth. And she never really had the support of her MP to start with. They weren't great supporters of hers when they had their own ballot. I do feel sorry for her in a way, because I think we could be reaching the stage where she is actually quite badly mentally affected by all that's going on, and maybe it would be better for things to come to an end sooner rather than later. I suspect that it will, because the given reason for her absence from the urgent question today was that she was with Graham Brady of the 1922 committee, which seems to me that her main concern right now, while her Chancellor is trying to pull her irons out of the fire and entirely reversing everything she did and supported, is to look after her own survival. And there comes a point at which maybe you should just give in. What happens next after that is another thing. But actually, I suspect some of the recovery in the markets that we may have seen may already have priced in her removal. So there is a sense of inevitability about it all.
Well, so at the moment, as far as we know, as we broadcast, Liz Truss is still Prime Minister. So let's move on to our third story tonight, William. So today is International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. And the SNP has said that a decade of Tory government is making things worse. Analysis today from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found that there has been an additional 1.5 million plunged into poverty since the Tories took office. The SNP say that child poverty has also increased as a result of Tory austerity measures, rising from 27% back in 2010-11 up to 31% by 2019-20, and that a further 20,000 children could be pushed into poverty if the UK government fails to follow through on their commitments to increase benefits in line with inflation during this cost of living crisis. The SNP's Working Pensions spokesperson, Kirsty Blackman MP, pointed to the contrast with the Scottish Government, which has retained and set ambitious targets for child poverty reduction, and introduced what she called the game-changing Scottish Child Payment, as well as 7 brand new social security payments, and is spending millions mitigating the UK government's benefit cap and bedroom tax. Commenting, Kirsty Blackman MP said, "Today is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. Therefore, it's truly heartbreaking to see this UK Tory government still failing to tackle poverty. Instead, they're making the crisis worse and putting lives in Scotland at risk and across the UK. Successive Westminster Tory governments have spent 12 years hacking away at the social security safety net and pushing people into poverty, destitution and hunger with their austerity agenda. And so we have now confirmed that this is going to continue with Tory austerity 2.0. And we could go so much further, but that can only be achieved with the full powers of independence." So once again, Kirsty Blackman pointed out, I suppose the key game changer, as she said, was the Scottish Child Payment. I think that goes this month to £25 per eligible child. So there's nothing like that in England. I wonder what do you think is the Labour Party response? How can we see such growth in poverty? And we don't really see campaigners. We don't really see the Labour Party doing much, saying much about it. Or am I being unfair to them?
Well, you can only go by what they're saying about things, and right now they seem to be triangulating madly. If anything, Rachel Reeves is talking about being harder line than the Tories are likely to be, particularly on things like benefits and other such matters. And it's this case of once a party like the Tories moves to the right, all it does is create a vacuum, and their opponents slide into the area that they have previously occupied. I don't feel the sense that things with the Labour Party are particularly radical. I don't see them coming up with a child payment thing, which, let's face it, from a very limited set of options the Scottish Government had, does seem to have been an effective way, at least of containing some of the child poverty that would have occurred. I think I'm right in saying that in percentage terms, although still horrendous, the Scottish figures are considerably better than the other nations and regions of the UK. I think we're down about 20%, as opposed to the 27%, he said, checking his notes, going up to 31% that you cited.
Yep, you're well informed. Actually, I did read last year another report by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which pointed out that the worst areas for poverty tend to be in the north of England. 20 years ago, they used to be in Scotland, not now. So, of course, yeah, it's not good that we've still got poverty in Scotland, but we definitely have, relatively speaking, definitely making more progress than in England. So now you mentioned, William, that you think that maybe Labour is positioning itself into that right-wing space left by the kind of centre-ground Tories. Now, next story is that Labour has blocked a former Conservative MP, Emma Dent-Coad, from the long list to fight that seat at the next election, a move which has sparked outrage among local campaigners. Ms Dent-Coad, who was elected in 2017 in a shock victory over the Conservatives by just 20 votes, is the leader of the Labour group on the council and lost her seat in 2019 to the Conservatives. The former MP, who was a member of the Socialist Campaign Group, the Corbyn loyal wing of the Parliamentary Labour Party, was the target of a number of stories in the tabloids during her time as an MP. They included a string of stories on the London mayoral candidate Sean Bailey, whom she called a token ghetto boy and a scumbag. Dent-Coad's exclusion is one of a number of where left-wingers have been excluded from the list of candidates. Maurice MacLeod, Labour councillor, a long-standing anti-racism campaigner, said he'd been disallowed from contesting Camberwell and Peckham. In Sedgefield, the seat of the former Prime Minister Tony Blair, that Labour lost to the Tories in 2019, 13 constituency officials resigned in protest after the CLP chair was blocked from standing after making a series of critical social media comments about Mr Starmer. The candidate, Paul Daly, has now resigned from the party. Earlier this week, Sam Tarry, the MP for Ilford South, was deselected by his local party in favour of the Redbridge Council leader, Jazz Atwal, in the culmination of a long-running local dispute. Labour has only one MP in Scotland, of course, and his reselection doesn't appear to be an issue. Okay, so William, I'm not up to date with the London politics. I don't know what the token ghetto boy comments were all about. But does this show that Labour is frightened to be accused of being Corbynite still? We've got to clean out anyone that looks radical left wing.
I think it does. I mean, obviously, there are always other reasons for blocking people from selection, usually disciplinary, and typically because of something they said on social media or elsewhere or something like that. I suspect in the current world in which we live, you can always find something for anybody that you say disqualifies them. So I believe that these are pretexts and that they really want to present themselves as pretty much a centrist party just to hoover up all the people who are appalled the way the Tories are running things. The sad thing is, I don't think they need to. I think they could, a perfectly good socialist, not way out socialist, but certainly progressive left platform that was credible without necessarily victimizing people and without crunching down on best, and they would win by a handsome majority. And I wish they would consider doing it.
Well, we'll see what develops with the opinion polls backing Labour in England. More ambiguous opinion polls in Scotland. Maybe we'll see if more information comes out over the next couple of weeks. Well, let's move on to our next story. Anyways, looking internationally, William, we've here a disturbing story tonight has reached us that the UN refugee Agency is demanding an urgent investigation into the discovery of 92 naked people on Greece's land border with Turkey, calling this incident shocking and saying it had been deeply distressed by the images of the group. These men, mainly from Afghanistan and Syria, were found close to the border after crossing the Evros River in rubber dinghies, according to Greek police. Children were among the group, according to the UNHCR spokesperson. We're asking for a full investigation because the circumstances are not clear, said Stella Naru, who's the agency's spokesperson in Athens. We are always against degrading and cruel treatment, and what we have seen is shocking. The images of these naked migrants, some bearing signs of injury, surfaced at the weekend after the reported discovery by patrol guards close to the river, which demarcates the border. In a statement, the Greek police said the men had testified that they'd been brought to the area in 3 Turkish military vehicles before being ordered to remove their clothes before boarding the inflatable boats. The testimonies, it claims, were given during the course of a joint investigation conducted by the Greek authorities with officials from Frontex, the EU's border agency. The group were immediately given clothes, food and first aid, and have been held in the various police and border guard stations since Saturday. Today, they're expected to be transferred from reception and identification centre in Greece's most northern western town in the coming days, where the UNHCR officials hope to speak to them. Now, this raises really questions about immigration into the EU. We shouldn't forget that although England's southern counties of England, of course, have been at the front of migration there, but the EU has its own migration issues. Does the EU have anything to boast about vis-a-vis UK in the treatment of refugees?
I wouldn't wish to get into a sort of league table. I think that we all need to be considering what needs to be done on the refugee front, because it's going to become the massive issue of the 21st century, as large numbers of people are forced by climate change and other uncertainties created by climate change into migrating to other parts of the world. And we have to learn to assimilate them and to treat them as normal people instead of othering them, instead of humiliating them, instead of seeing them as a disadvantage. They should be an asset to us. And one of the really pleasing things about the Scottish Government paper today, to come back to that again, is that it is very positive on immigration to Scotland, and the reaction to not quite the same thing, but the Ukrainian refugees in Scotland, where we have taken in more than our fair share, I think is a good thing and something to boast about. I don't really have much time either for the UK's approach to the migrants crossing the Channel, or indeed to the treatment of refugees on the fringes of the EU.
Yes, indeed. For one reason or another, throughout the world there are literally millions of people on the move, not through choice, but fleeing something. So it's a problem in all countries, isn't it? I mean, basically, could we say, looking back at this period of the 21st century, that it's about the time when poor people went on the move and rich people tried to keep them out?
That's one way of looking at it, but not maybe even just rich people, although they may be behind it somewhere. But we're a troubled species in terms of accepting people who are different, and we need to change. It's an existential issue for us.
Mm-hmm. Yep, thanks, William. So let's move on to our next story now. Police Scotland have issued another video campaign called "Be a Mate, Don't Be That Guy." It's another video. Police have launched today their new campaign aimed at preventing sexual offending, following last year's viral "That Guy" campaign, which challenged men's attitudes and behaviour towards women by putting the cause of sexual offending where it belongs, with men. This year's campaign urged men to be the solution by having those difficult conversations with that friend who may have crossed the line. Men are being challenged to be a mate, to step in and to put a stop to behaviour that might put their friends at risk of sexual offending. That Guy builds on previous Police Scotland sexual crime prevention campaigns targeting men from 18 to 35 years who are statistically most likely to commit sexual offences. The aim is to urge men to take responsibility for their actions and language and to help effect a cultural change to tackle sexual crime against women. The campaign features a new advert which will run on several online platforms, including social media. Launching the campaign, Deputy Chief Constable Malcolm Graham of Police Scotland said, "Last year's campaign asked men to reflect on their own behaviours and attitudes, and those of their friends, family, and colleagues towards women to prevent rape, sexual assault, and harassment. Our new campaign is about what men can do. It asks them to think about the impact their friends' behaviour has on women and to step in and to be that friend. Be the mate who takes a friend aside and has the quiet word. It's about stopping a friend doing something that they will regret." Yeah, I haven't seen any statistics on the efficacy of that guy, but I thought it was quite effective for him. Did you think so? Do you think that's a good way of reaching a target audience? Don't be that guy.
It's already demonstrated its worth, I think, last year, and therefore it's a good idea to repeat it. It really is about time we approach the whole issue of really all of this treatment of women, less by advising women on how they should behave and how they should not go places and just watch how they go. It's actually up to men to fix this, because it's you can see behaviours in your buddies, very likely, that may fall short of really bad stuff, but it could be the thin end of the wedge. And we should recognise that it's entirely unacceptable in this day and age to behave like that. And it's for us to self-police. And so, great initiative. I hope it does work. And I think it's worth, so hats off.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and maybe it's depressing that how long is it since feminism became a thing, and since women started to say we've got the right to go where we want to, we shouldn't have to be frightened of going to certain parts of town at night. Isn't that a bit depressing that we still have to do that? It must be about 50 years ago since I heard women saying we're going to reclaim the night. Fighters still have to do it.
Takes a long time to learn, I'm afraid, but we're getting there.
Okay, well, so well done, Police Scotland, for bringing us another version of the "Don't Be That Guy," or have a word with him and tell him not to be that guy. Okay. We're of course guys. We should reflect ourselves maybe on our behaviour, and maybe we should actually think seriously about having a word with anyone we see misbehaving or misspeaking. Let's move on to our last story for tonight, William. On the media. Now, we've got 1 million UK households have given up their streaming on the streaming revolution this year as the cost of living crisis increasingly focuses budget-conscious consumers and maybe makes them stop taking services that they really don't need, such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, or Disney+. The premiere of two of the most hyped, expensive shows of all time, costing $650 million, that's about 580 million sterling, the productions of Rings of Power and House of the Dragon, failed to prove a big enough draw to reverse the decline of another 234,000 homes with at least one paid streaming service in the third quarter of this year. The total number of UK homes who have at least one paid-for subscription has now fallen by 937,000. That's between January and September this year, as cost-conscious households choose paying for the essentials such as energy, food, or mortgage payments over home entertainment. Just over 16 million UK homes now pay for at least one subscription of video on demand service. That's according to Kantar World Panel. More than 5 million homes have the three most popular services, which are Netflix, Prime, and Disney+, which together cost about £300 annually. That's according to media regulator Ofcom. In Scotland, 60% of households had a subscription streaming service last year. Okay, no streaming services there. The media is in a mess again. So do you think this is good news for the BBC if people maybe had their fling with the streaming services and are now going back to the good old BBC?
Well, we don't know how many people are starting to pay their license fee again. I suspect the same things might drive them not to pay for their license fee as indeed now, not just political disagreements, but as force them to think about streamlining their streaming. It's perfectly sensible behaviour in the circumstances. I think the new media has got some way to go yet, and I think there will be some changes, and itself it will evolve over time. Whether it's just a UK phenomenon right now, I don't know. I suspect that Netflix is maybe falling in lots of places, but Disney Plus and Amazon Prime are going great guns elsewhere, I think. So in a way, I'm not surprised, but I don't think it's the end of the world.
We, of course, in Broadcasting Scotland are a small part of the media market, but what we're doing, of course, is news. Now, what Netflix, and I don't know the others, but certainly Netflix doesn't do news, doesn't do sport, doesn't do weather forecasts. So they've always just cherry-picked, haven't they? They've gone for the big audience, big blockbusters. But can anyone actually run a news service in any country on the sort of subscription model?
It's tricky these days, I think. People are used to getting things for what they regard as free, and that is an obstacle to be overcome. We're particularly bad in funding these things in this country, and I mean by that both the UK and Scotland, I might add. And indeed, Broadcasting Scotland, I'm sure, needs the money. And I would encourage you all, and I know the anchor usually does this, so I'll leave it to you, but I would encourage you all to think about taking out a subscription if you don't already.
Well, it's good to have your support anyway, but the big issue, of course, is that news is expensive, but at the same time, it's extremely important. Moving into New Scotland, I don't know if this is going to be in any of the other briefing papers. Should the Scottish people vote for independence? What do you think should be the regulatory framework for broadcasting in Scotland? Well, for media in general, should there be some sort of Scottish Ofcom?
I think there should be, yes, and I think there will be. There's no reason why we shouldn't we should regulate it fairly firmly, I think, but not in such a way that it stops organisations from being able to come into broadcasting, because other countries have small broadcasters all over the place, I think. Um, other areas of countries have got their broadcasts, and we don't even have a national broadcaster as such in Scotland, certainly not a mainstream one. So it should be firm but not discouraging, and I think we should otherwise certainly make sure we regulate it. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose there must be other models that the Scottish Government can look at. You have to, of course, on one hand, support creativity and free speech, but you also have to make sure that people are being informed. Is it important in a democracy that you have, a diversity of both printed media and online media? Is it important that quality information and a diversity of views is easily available for voters to make their minds up?
In a word, yes. It's the one thing we absolutely lack in our current independence debate and in other areas of Scottish life. Totally crucial.
Okay, so that's the conclusion there, that people are giving up streaming services. But as William pointed out, yeah, the BBC isn't free anyway. So that's my solution anyway, William. I'm going to keep my Netflix subscription going. Afraid I haven't found the money for the BBC last year. Well, that's about it for tonight. So I'd like to thank William Duguid for joining us today to discuss those fascinating issues on the day when the Scottish Government released its long-awaited white paper on the economy, the economics of independence. So I actually had to have a look at that, or at least the summarised version. Now, as William said, we are, of course, a free-to-air broadcaster, and we depend on your subscriptions. We don't get any funding from any other source. So thank you for watching, and especially if you are one of our subscribers, it's really good to have you on board. If you'd like to give us a hand, and if you'd like to help us continue doing a kind of broadcasting for Scotland, then if you look at our website, the link's on the screen below me there. Just for £5 a month, you can become one of our supporters, and we'll be very delighted to have you. Right, so that's it from me and from William Duguid tonight. We'll be back to Scotland at 7 tomorrow. Thanks for watching. See you later.